Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cracking Addiction. My name is Dr. Ferghal Armstrong, and today I have the great pleasure of speaking with Dr. Raphael Cuomo. Raphael, you are a professor, but what are you a professor of?
I'm a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Diego. I am a scientist, and I spend much of my time looking at data around cancer primarily, and also risk factors associated with addiction.
Right. So there's actually two main interests. You've got cancer and addiction. Now, a lot of people might have thought that these are somewhat removed, but I hope today that you're going to explain to us how actually that is not the case and they are quite related. But first of all, can we explore a little bit about your background and how did you end up as a professor of medicine in California?
Certainly. So I became a professor. Well, first I went through a PhD program in global public health, and I was very interested in cancer due to its very heavy disease burden, globally speaking.
Mm,
So cancer accounts for a tremendous amount of disease worldwide, as well as a tremendous amount of death, and that's a topic that got me very interested in that from a public health perspective. And I got very interested as well in the kinds of techniques, the kind of approaches that we can apply from a public health perspective to reduce the burden of cancer globally and in a public health in a population health context. And so that led me to recognize, and this is clear and consistent in the literature, the very important role of health behaviors in the prevention of many of the most incident cancers. Just draw a very clear, obvious example: smoking and lung cancer, right? Individuals who
yeah.
smoke have a dramatically higher increase for lung cancer. And individuals who do not smoke are very unlikely to get it, relatively speaking. And so that's a very clear one. But there are a number of other kinds of behaviors, both bad behaviors and good behaviors, that will increase or decrease risk for many very common cancers.
Can we talk about what those other lifestyle factors might be that implicate other cancers? I mean, smoking and lung cancer is obvious, but what about the less obvious relationships, like especially I'm thinking about diet and cancer?
Absolutely. So there are a number of dietary factors that are related to risk for cancer. So one that I like to explain is high sugar intake. High sugar intake will increase levels of blood glucose and increase insulin in the blood, and that
Yeah,
will
yeah.
cause an increase in growth hormone receptors in the liver, increase activation of a number of downstream factors that will increase IGF-1 production, and that in very high levels will cause the activation of cellular pathways that will promote the cell going from a stable state, the stable state that it's in, to a growth phase state. And by doing that, you get, of course, a proliferation of cells at an unhealthy level, the development of
Mm,
lesions and tumors, and eventually that grows to a point where it becomes cancerous. And so sugar is just one example. Of course, there are many
yeah.
others: red meat,
What about
processed
red
meat,
meat?
alcohol. Exactly.
What about
So
red and
red
processed meat?
Yes. So processed meat in particular is the worst, but red meat this association also
Ugh,
exists, especially with cytotoxic heme in the meat. But
yeah.
these foods have compounds in them that will cause direct DNA damage and mutations,
Mm,
much like oxidating other kind of oxidative chemicals. You increase the activation of oncogenes and decrease tumor suppressor functions, and that will,
yeah.
as well, also increase the kinds of molecular pathways at the cell that will result in the cell moving from a stable state to one where it's encouraged to divide to a point that it's uncontrollable and will cause the development of tumors.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's important for people to understand that there are many, many ways to actually getting a diagnosis of cancer of really any organ system, and it's not just avoiding smoking.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm,
And so I talk in the book about many addictive behaviors.
Mm,
Smoking and nicotine is part of the book, but also alcohol, also food addictions, things that we
mm.
wouldn't necessarily think as having there are other things that we wouldn't necessarily think as having an influence on cancer risk, like screen addiction and kinds of hyperstimulation that we have in our society that prevent us from getting into a rhythm of rest and repair that would allow our bodies to do things like clear cancer cells, which our immune system is actually adapted to do.
So your journey, your initial interest was sparked by this relationship, this epidemiological relationship between lifestyle and cancer. And then what did you
Absolutely.
do?
Well, so it became clear to me, as it's clear to many others in the field, that we need to promote healthier behaviors if we're going to have a sizable impact on the reduction of cancer in society. But
Mm.
it became increasingly clear to me that simply from a public health intervention perspective, telling patients at primary care or putting up billboards and signs and what have you to encourage people to go exercise and eat healthier foods isn't on its own really sufficient. Those are fantastic initiatives, but I feel that public health needs to move upstream to our mindset, to the way that we perceive these kinds of behaviors. We need to really probe into every individual's relationship with these behaviors, both the bad and the good, and to try to understand what might be preventing those individuals from breaking free from bad habits and what might be preventing them from engaging in the good habits. And that's where I got really interested in addiction.
So what are those factors?
The
What
so
makes
I
me not exercise as much as I know I should?
Well, it is certainly a difficult thing to do, right? And for every patient, it's individual. And this is a new kind of, there's much research that needs to be done in this area. But for every individual, there are going to be, individualized reasons why they are not engaging in these behaviors. One of
Mm.
the reasons for these poor behaviors is that they are stimulating the dopaminergic system, that the same systems that are stimulated with other forms of addiction. So we're talking about the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, the same kinds of dopaminergic signaling, which would hook us on more serious drugs that you can overdose on and for which we tend to
Uh,
diagnose clinical substance abuse disorders. And though these other addictions, things like food addictions, things like screen addictions, don't necessarily rise to the level of clinical significance where they're having such disability on an individual's life that we'd have a different criteria for diagnoses, they still have this kind of subclinical impact and a clear biological impact that accumulates over time that can raise the risk for chronic diseases.
you've alluded to the causes of cancer. And basically what you're saying is it's all about lifestyle. Cancer is a modifiable lifestyle disease.
In large part, I would say that that is indeed
Yeah.
true.
I mean,
Yeah.
there are genetic influences, etc. But we have to acknowledge that lifestyle plays a significant role in the development of most cancers. Is that something that you can agree with?
Yes, I would say that that is true. Yeah, the majority of the risk factors are those that are going to be associated with lifestyle.
And what you're saying then is that those same lifestyle factors also are involved in addiction. Is that right?
Yes. In particular, how we perceive them as rewarding, how difficult it is to break free from them. Those simulate the same kind of neurobiological pathways as the addictions with which we're more familiar.
What are the specific pathways in the brain that cause or mediate addiction, as far as you're concerned?
The same kind of pathways, that we are familiar with are stimulated by many of these lifestyle habits. We're talking about the mesolimbic dopamine pathway being very responsible for a lot of this. Nucleus accumbens, ventral tegmental area. So this is the same dopaminergic signaling we have with many of the others, right? And it's not necessarily about the stimulus itself, I'm sure you're familiar, but it's about the seeking of that stimulus, right? The desire to go after it. That is what really stimulates the dopamine. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's important for people to understand that the mesolimbic dopamine pathway is absolutely crucial for survival because it allows you to memorize where the last piece of fruit was last, or 2 years ago when it was last this hot and dry, so that you can actually remember where that piece of fruit was. And that's if you were in a situation of being dependent on that last piece of fruit, that would be a survival benefit. But addiction hijacks that. Dopamine isn't actually a pleasure hormone. It's "I want to do it again" hormone.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's really the opioid system that's more the pleasure hormone. It's a dopamine system that, as you say, it's the desire, the seeking hormone, and yeah, so it's indeed. So I'm referring primarily to the dopamine system as being relevant in our inability to break free. And in fact, the opioid and dopamine systems kind of get flattened out when we continue to engage in these behaviors. Right? We are not able to feel the same kind of reward nor the same kind of pleasure from these repeated behaviors. And so we seek to do it more and more often. And then these foods that we're addicted to, the caffeine, the nicotine, the alcohol that we once got some pleasure from, we no longer get pleasure from. And so we just need it now to feel normal. And it gets normalized and people do it
Exactly.
every single day.
Exactly. That for me is a key statement. I just do it now to feel normal. I think people need to understand that, in the beginning of your experience, well, certainly I'm only talking now about substances, and I'll ask your opinion about lifestyle factors and food in a moment. But in terms of substances, when people use substances, first of all, it's used impulsively with positive reinforcement, which means it's fun. Yeah, using substances is fun, and if it wasn't fun, I wouldn't have a job. But then there comes a point when the use becomes compulsive and negatively reinforcing, whereby you don't get high anymore. You just don't feel shitty anymore. So you avoid all of the negative withdrawal symptoms plus all of the other psychosocial adversity and your psychosocial context. And so you just take it to feel normal. And for me, when people say that, that is a key milestone in their addiction. That means if you're having to use a drug just to feel normal, that's when you really do need help. So how does that translate to lifestyle factors?
I think it's much the same. So people out there who are addicted to junk food and ultra processed foods,
Mm,
they need it to feel normal. You start eating healthy and your body reacts. Your mind tells you, "Oh, I feel like this is not satiating. This is not making me feel good. My taste buds are not reacting in the way that I'd like them to because it's not junk food." And so
mm,
people just need to keep on eating junk food in order to feel like they have, this normalcy in their life. And that gets
yeah,
particularly problematic for diseases like cancer and cardiovascular disease because these issues accumulate over time, right? The systemic inflammation, the chronic inflammation that we feel we get as a result of consuming these foods over a day, it's not too big a deal, but repeated every single day over years and years and years, you will develop chronic disease. And the fact that it is addictive is something that makes it very difficult for people to stop eating ultra processed foods and to start eating healthy foods. Makes people very difficult to stop with alcohol, with chronic overstimulation, things like screens, for example, which we don't necessarily recognize as being something that we can be addicted to. That
mm,
overstimulation is something that a lot of people feel that they need in order to feel normal at the end of the day. They
yeah,
need to
yeah, yeah,
scroll
yeah,
through their social media feeds and have that
yeah,
kind of stimulation and they're no longer able, they feel uncomfortable resting and
yes,
relaxing and reflecting on their lives.
absolutely. Yes, this frenetic quest for stimulation.
Yes, indeed, and that's a theme in my book as well. So, the inability that we have nowadays in our modern society to get into a rhythm of restorative repair. Now we are seeking constant stimulation, whether it's at work, whether it's on our screens, whether it's through caffeine or nicotine or something. We seem to have become uncomfortable with the concept of stopping and resting and reflecting, and that's
Yeah.
so necessary, in so many different ways.
Yeah, I don't know, are you aware of Anna Lemke's book, The Dopamine Nation?
I've heard of it, yes. I've taken a
Yeah,
look.
yeah, yeah. So she talks about having to have a rest, and having a break from dopamine, and I think this is very much something that you're saying. You need to
Absolutely.
rest your dopamine system. So
Absolutely.
we've we've only scratched the surface of lifestyle and addiction, process addictions. But you're making this leap to cancer.
Yes.
Talk to us about this leap.
So it is a much needed leap, I would say. I would say we need to argue for a prevention 2.0, a new prevention in chronic diseases that does not look solely at behaviors nor solely at treatments, but also goes upstream to look at the way that we think about the lifestyle habits. And so that's really the critical leap, that we don't just think about addiction as it works both ways. We don't just think about cancer as behaviors and treatments influencing cancer, and we don't just think about addiction as the behavioral and social consequences of addiction, but we go 2 steps down or 2 steps up each way, right? Addiction influences behaviors, influences risk for chronic disease. We need to see the whole spectrum, and we need to have a new and more holistic approach at preventing chronic diseases and as well understanding the long-stream implications of these subclinical addictions.
I'm interested in substances and processes and their relationship with cancer. So let's look at the substances first. I mean, we know that smoking is addictive and smoking causes cancer, but like having the direct carcinogenic effects of something like heroin or alcohol or methamphetamine. What would you say to that? Are these substances directly carcinogenic?
I would hesitate on the word directly
Mm.
because the influence of some of these stimulants on the cells themselves and their ability to mutate and their ability to over proliferate exist, but are indirect, I would say. They do
All
things
right.
like some of these stimulants, for example, they do things like they raise cortisol, and they do so in a way that is chronic. And having a higher level of cortisol chronically all the time because of hyperstimulation, whether it's due to things like phone or caffeine or nicotine or meth or any of these other wide variety of gradients of stimulants, they will result in increased cortisol, which will increase risk for bad long-term outcomes for these other diseases. So it's not in a
Mm.
vacuum, right? You don't have somebody that is constantly addicted to the stimulants all the time, seeking stimulation through one form or another, and that just causes some, terrible, horrible, sometimes social, psychological issues. But we have to recognize that in addition to that, there are going to be long stream consequences, things that you can't just resolve in a few days.
Mm.
And we really need to intervene on these in order to prevent some of those long stream consequences from occurring.
In terms of process addictions, then, or effectively, let's talk about food addiction or screen time addiction. What you're saying is that these processes initiate physiological changes in the body that will then downstream or longstream have an effect on cancer. So what are those physiological mechanisms that will increase your cancer risk from something as apparently innocuous as sitting on the sofa too long and watching too much TV?
Absolutely. So some of them are more direct. So things like tobacco and alcohol are going to have more direct carcinogenic effects on the state of
Mm.
your DNA and DNA breaks and mutation and your inability of your immune system to repair or eliminate mutated cancer cells. But some of them are going to be less direct, right? So we're talking about things like the chronic overstimulation, hyperstimulation, causing things like increased cortisol and decreased ability to sleep. Right. In that particular
Mm.
scenario, decreased ability of sleep due to
Yeah,
dysregulated melatonin is going to prevent your
yeah,
body from repairing any of those cells. But there are other mechanisms as well. Things like chronic inflammation, insulin
yeah,
resistance, and immune
yeah.
dysfunction are all they're associated with different kinds of addiction, but
Mm.
many of these are subclinical addictions we don't necessarily think of
Mm.
as having extreme consequences on our life, but accumulated again every single day for years and years and years over time, there's going to be a clear biological effect on human cells and a clear increase in risk for chronic diseases, especially I would say cancer.
One of the processes in the body that interests me is epigenetics. You can have two people can have the same gene sequence and yet have vastly different outcomes. And this also relates to lifestyle and cancer risk. Can you explain a little bit what epigenetics is and how this might explain the link that you're trying to establish between lifestyle diseases and cancer, or lifestyle addiction and cancer?
Absolutely. So, to put it very simply, epigenetics is how your genes respond to the external outputs of the cell, right? So,
Yeah.
for example, um, if you eat a lot of sugar, your body's going to react differently than if you didn't, and your
Mm,
cell would respond to that. The outside of the cell sees that and then makes the inside of the cell do different kinds of things. And those different kinds of things may be the difference between the cell dividing uncontrollably and becoming a tumor or staying in a healthy state long term.
mm. So that's epigenetics, but how does it relate? To explain a little bit more detail the function of epigenetics on cancer and how it relates to lifestyle.
Absolutely. So the activation of oncogenes in cases in which you are engaging in behaviors that would activate these genes that would cause the proliferation of your cells,
Mm,
as well as the activation of tumor suppressor genes on the other side for the more
mm,
healthy behaviors that would result in your body um, eliminating cells that have these genetic mutations that are cancerous. So you have both positive and negative behaviors having
mm,
influences on the cell, and they respond accordingly, right? So you can have two people with the same exact genetic sequence, but the cells
mhm.
are responding in different. They're doing different things because those two people are engaging in different kinds of behaviors.
One person is addicted to broccoli, doesn't get cancer. One person is addicted to sugar and does get cancer.
Right, exactly. And that's all because the body's responding differently to those different things. And again, can be the exact same genetic sequence in both people.
So effectively, what you're saying is, another way of putting this is that we all have a genetic ticking time bomb. The difference between people who have cancer and who don't have cancer is epigenetics and which is related to lifestyle. But let's just clarify the role of addiction in that lifestyle. You're saying that addiction causes the lifestyle changes, which causes the epigenetic changes, which either increases or decreases your risk of cancer. That's the chain, yeah?
That is the chain of events. That's right. And how you
Right.
get into addiction is, very individual, right? The different people
Mhm.
encounter these behaviors for the first time, and there are different kinds of social and psychological influences which would result perhaps in different people.
Mm.
Some people may become addicted to things like junk food. Some people may engage with it and not become addicted. So there might be a personality component that's going on here, and that's a whole area of research we need to address more, especially with these subclinical addictions that I'm referring to. But yeah, that's at the core. That is the sequence of events that's at the heart of the book.
You mentioned a book. Tell us about your book.
The book is called Crave: The Hidden Biology of Addiction and Cancer. It's available on, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and various different websites online. It's available on ebook and paperback and hardcover. It's not a long book. I know a lot of other scientists, write very, very long form, but I've tried very much to keep it in a manageable length. It is a little
Mm.
bit dense in some parts, so you might have to read a little slowly to get through all of it, but I think that I try to be efficient with the reader's attention and try to get them
Mm.
through, the key awareness that they need to develop in order to understand the role of addiction in behaviors in cancer, as well as what those addictions are. And hopefully, by doing that, I can encourage people to reflect on their own lives and to understand, hey, what is it that I may be addicted to, that, I may be needing every single day in order to get through the day that might not be serving my long-term health. Hopefully, people have that reflective moment. And in the book, I have some recommendations about what people can do to step back and to try to to get away from these addictive behaviors and live healthier lifestyles and prevent cancer.
Professor Raphael Cuomo, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Likewise, thank you for having me on.
That's all for today, folks. My name's Dr. Ferghal Armstrong, and this has been Cracking Addiction.